Greetings, bakers. I'm the developer of Wrangler, and I want to talk a bit about the version 2 beta, which is going live at the same time as this video. I do want to apologise that it's taken this long to actually release it. Probably started on it about a year and a half ago, but life and stuff. So we have one of those good news, bad news situations. Bad news is that updating to version 2 is not going to be free. Good news is that paying to update is going to fund the continued maintenance of the software, since new Blender versions like to break stuff. But, I do want to take a minute to talk about it. So, if I were rich, I'd honestly just make the entire add-on free, but as it is, I really need some kind of income from the product to fund maintenance of it. It's been over 5 years now, and, while it did pretty well in the first year to pay for itself, things have slowed down a lot now, so maybe that's lack of advertising, or simply that everyone who wants it has already got it. There just might not be the biggest market for people who are willing to pay for a baking tool in Blender. Personally, I prefer the workflow using Blender to bake, but that's me. Not for everyone. In any case, that's the situation with that. So I'm going to be giving a 50% discount off if you update to this beta version. So do note that it is a beta, so I do expect there to be at least some bugs. And the discount is to encourage you to test it out and report the bugs so that I can get them fixed. And I'll go over the bug reporting at the end of the video. So if when you install it you get anything funky happening, just remember to follow the standard process of disable the add-on, uninstall the add-on, restart Blender, reinstall the add-on. That procedure usually corrects any issues when you update. There are also some changes to nodes that you won't see unless you add a new version of the node, since the changes only happen when you first place it in the node tree. But it's pretty much restricted to just the settings node, so you might want to replace any of those in your existing recipes. So first, let's just take a quick look at the preferences, where I've actually removed most of them. The reason for that is that going forward we're going to be using presets mostly to store things, and that invalidates the need for most of the preferences. So you'll see that I've gone back to having the text window open as when you click bake as the default. So I think that's probably better for new users to know something's actually happening. There's also this recipe lib folder that you can set. The default's going to be in your add-ons folder, so you might want to change that if you need to or want to. There's also this retry option, which you might not be aware of, which is useful for long tasks. It will automatically keep retrying a bake task from where it was last up to, should it stop for any reason. As long as the task gets further each time, it will keep retrying until it either finishes or breaks at the same place twice. Finally, I've added this disable no crash option, especially for the beta. Basically, when I first wrote the baker, there were a bunch of weird things that would just cause the process to crash Blender for no real reason, like there being a meta ball or a modifier referencing some object, etc. Just kind of random cases. So I implemented a bunch of steps to convert things to meshes, apply modifiers, and such as a workaround. I think now in Blender 4 most of that stuff is fixed, so I'm disabling that process by default using this option. If you find your bake crashes, try turning the option off and seeing if that fixes it, and if so, let me know what combination you had that caused it to crash with this setting turned on, because I think that it should mostly work now, and be a bit better performance-wise to have those settings turned off. Let's move on to the nodes. most obvious changes are going to be to the settings node. When I merged all the settings into a single node, I didn't really think about how that would make it a lot less intuitive as to which settings applied to what. So I've added the 3 color-coded sockets to differentiate where they apply. There's unfortunately a pretty big drawback with this, that since they're now attached to the sockets, when you try to get the mouse over tooltip, instead shows the socket tooltip. I couldn't find any way around this, so I've duplicated the layout in the side panel. And the tooltips all work there as you would expect. It's not the greatest solution, but I really couldn't find a better way than what I ended up with, so I'm open to suggestions. So I could perhaps merge the advanced tabs into the main tab, but they do get a bit long when they're both open. And most of the stuff in the advanced tab you don't really need to mess with, so yeah, I'm not sure. Does anyone have a strong opinion either way on this? Let me know. Anyway, you can see I've removed the X and Y size from past settings and replaced it with the super sample drop-down. That's just going to multiply your output size by the selected factor. I don't think there's really any reason to want to set the exact bake pixel size to something that isn't a multiple of 2 of the output size, and so having 2 places with the X and Y size just seemed a bit confusing. I've also moved and changed the color mode to be this BW RGB toggle, and if your image format supports it, there's this alpha toggle, which will just enable the alpha input socket on the output node. Some people had trouble finding how to write to the alpha channel in the previous setup, so I hope this makes it a lot clearer. I don't generally recommend writing alpha unless you want to actually use it as alpha, but you do you. Biggest change is, of course, now that we have presets for the settings node, so you can just save your settings with the preset menu and load them as needed. I'm pretty sure these get copied over when you update Blender as well. The slight issue though, which there is probably some way to fix, currently when you add a preset, use the active node to take the settings from. Unfortunately, clicking the preset button doesn't make the node active. So you can have a different node selected and try to create a preset which will break or store the wrong settings. So until I find some fix, make sure to select the node you want to save before interacting with the preset menu. I could restrict the menu to the sidebar, which would prevent it happening, but I feel like that restriction isn't really worth it. I'll just demonstrate. So I've got a 4K preset. There we go, change some of the settings. But now if I select a node that isn't this, and I can still open the preset menu, try to add new preset, and you'll see an error because the node does not have array distance setting. So just make sure to click on the setting, then you can add it. I've also added a bunch of additional passes, vector displacement, sculpt face set, UV island, etc. But those are all fairly self-explanatory. I do want to mention the new input node, UV transfer. Now this is something you could do before by just adding the same object as the source and target, but setting different UV maps on them. But that worked by doing a bake from one object to the other, which mostly works, but with intersecting and very close faces it could generate artifacts, and I think sharp edges could be projected slightly wrong. Anyway, I've added this input specifically for baking from one set of UVs on the object to another, and it does it without doing the projection thing from before, so everything should be perfectly aligned without any artifacts. Test it out. Let me know if you find any issues with that. Should be a good addition. So what else did I want to talk about? Oh, right, I added that whole library thing. So this is an alternative to the assets library, though it works in basically the same way. The difference being that the nodes are appended to the current file rather than instanced, which doesn't actually work. So when you save a recipe, it's going to strip all the objects, references and such from the nodes, so you should just end up with a node tree and no stray objects hitching a ride. It's pretty simple to use with the side panel under the Wrangler tab there. Just add, remove and load them. So use the plus and minus button, load recipe. Let's just save this one and load it. I don't love the Python interface for doing this because there's no way to append to an unopened blend file. So the library has to actually be completely rewritten every time you add or remove anything, but that's what's available. We'll probably want to revisit the Blender Assets library someday when they make it more add-on friendly. Anyway, I think this is a pretty big improvement combined with the settings presets to make things way more reusable between projects. Now there's two things I considered adding but didn't end up doing. The first was being able to split the output by material slot. It's possible, of course, but I don't know how useful it is. You can already do that by just using tiled output and placing the material UVs into separate tiles. It's a little bit of extra work, but it's not that much. Is this something people really want? Let me know. The other was having a way to combine objects before baking. It's been requested a few times because of how it increases performance, but it's quite awkward to do just because of how merging interacts with UV maps and modifiers. Maybe if the no anti-crash thing works out, then it could be done via GeoNodes instancing, but then I'd have to do a bunch of testing on how that actually works out. It's just difficult to create a general purpose solution because merging objects can break stuff in lots of ways. Not convinced that the performance gains are really worth the complications. I think it might be something to revisit in the future. Comment, I guess, if it's something that's really important to you. So, one last thing before we get on to the bug reporting. I've added these commands to the objects node side panel. They're sort of not directly related to baking, but I found it pretty useful and thought, why not include it here? Firstly, there's a button to actually select the objects that are in the node. That's whatever. But I added these UV map tools. So previously, if you had a bunch of objects, I guess let's just add a few. So previously you would have to previously you had a bunch of objects you wanted to specify a UV map for baking. You have to go through and set each one, which would be pretty horrible if you had a lot of objects. So you'd have to click each of these, select the UV map you wanted. It's fine for a couple, but it gets a bit tedious. Now you can just use this field to set them all at once. So UV map, and they're all set. It also has a shift and control click option. So if you shift click, it will create the UV map if the object doesn't already have one name to it. So let's just add bake to all of these objects. And of course it still sets the UV map as well as creating it. And finally you can control click to use whatever the current active UV is. So for these it was all UV map. So one thing I found useful is sometimes I'm working with a bunch of separate objects that share a UV map and I want to switch between editing them. I'll just create two of these nodes, and in one I'll have them set to bake whatever, and then in the other I'll set them to whatever the other UV I'm using is. And then I can use this third button which sets the current active UV. So if I want to switch to UV map, I'll hit this one. Then when I go back to editing the bake UV, I can hit this, and it'll just swap the active UVs between the two sets. There's actually one more thing I wanted to mention before we go to the debugging. There's the file names node. This is the main way of splitting your output into different files, and it's had a bunch of updates. So you can now set a frame range if you want to bake out an animation. You can just look at the tooltip for the format there, but you can set individual frames, a range, and set a stepping for going between them. The other thing added is token substitution, which you turn on with this checkbox and affects the names part of the image. So we can use those tokens to decide where they appear in the name and if they appear at all. The tokens will add up the object, which is the object name, the suffix, which is what you specify in the output node, UDIM tile number if it's using tiles, and the frame number if you're using a frame range. So I think that's pretty much everything I wanted to cover. Probably forgot something. Anyway, I also rewrote the material hand-indling system for PBR output. The previous implementation essentially rewrote the entire material back to the shader nodes, which was fine, gave a lot of option for control, but in various Blender versions they tanked the performance of modifying node trees via Python. And with very complex materials where you had a lot of nested node groups and such, actually would sometimes look like the program had hung, but then if you waited 5 to 10 minutes, you'd find it was just processing the material. I think currently the performance is okay, but I wanted to make it a lot more efficient to sidestep any future issues. So the new system changes only the bare minimum of nodes. And I think I've got most of the bugs out, but since it's a large part of the PBR process and it's basically entirely new code, if there are problems, I'd expect them to mostly crop up here. So it does only affect PBR bakes, and if you have a PBR bake fail, try to isolate which material is breaking it, and if possible, send me the material along with a low-res version of the texture so I can see what's going on. So if the icon in the tray, which is down the bottom right there, goes red, you can actually control click it to bring up a log. Let's just demonstrate that. So while it didn't fail, we can still control click on it and it will bring up a log of what happened, which is a lot more detailed than what you get in the standard output there. So you can actually always control click on the icon to get a more detailed log. And if you're getting any issues, it'd be great to copy and paste that to me. If you're looking, it might also tell you, what object was causing, what object or material was actually the problem when it crashed or stopped working. So yeah, if you can send me a copy of the log and your material along with low-res textures, I can definitely see what happened and fix it. I also tried to make the thing work with non-principled shaders, so you should get decent output with pretty much all of the shader types, unless you're trying to bake a volume material or something, but any normalish material should mostly work. Not all of the data values will come out, but most of the common ones will. There's basically 3 ways the add-on can break. The easiest to fix is when the icon is red and you can just control click it, see the log, and there's some Python error. Easy fix. The second is when you get the green success icon, but bake doesn't turn out as expected. That could be a bit more tricky, and I really need to be able to recreate the whole thing to see what's going on. So at a minimum, I need the materials you were using and the recipe, but preferably if you could just send me the whole the whole blend file. That's really the best for figuring those out. And if you can just pack in low-res versions of the textures so actually can get a visual indication of whether it's working or not. Final case is where Blender itself crashes. Now, the add-on should usually, well, it should never crash the foreground process, but the background process doing the baking can potentially crash. There shouldn't be any of those because it's usually only if there's a bug in Blender or if your system runs out of resources, like GPU memory is a big one. It's the main cause for that, but if that is happening repeatedly to you, there might not be anything in the control click log, and you have to dig around in your temp directory for an actual crash log generated by Blender. A bit harder to work out what's going on with that, but if it does happen, let me know and we'll try and get to the bottom of it. Anyway, that's pretty much it for now. I'd like to make some more instructional videos about how to use everything once the beta's done, so hope I can find the time to do that. I'm going to sign off now. Happy baking and catch you later.